I'd now like to introduce to you all the facilitator of this next session, Genevieve Jacobs, Group Editor with Region Media and one of our media partners for the summit. And Region Media are really changing the face of regional media. Genevieve will also be joined by the Deputy Secretary, Rosemary Deininger, Richard Norton, CEO of Food Agility, Allister Clarke, PhD student for Sturt University, Gabriela Ceregra, Data Policy Manager for Food Agility CRC, and Dan Winson, CEO and founder of Zetifi, who will now be joining us virtually as well. So I'll now hand you over to the very capable hands of Genevieve.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome from me. I'm Genevieve Jacobs. I'm the Group Editor for the Region Media Group, which is based in Canberra, but in the process of expanding very rapidly into regional New South Wales, and we very much hope further afield. If you're here in Wagga, you'll see our Region Riverina News website going live within the next week or so. Our Riverina editor, Chris Rowe, and our business manager, Adam Drummond, who's here today, along with a couple of other staff, are also in place. And this is very much because we believe, like you do, in the future of the regions, and we believe that the future is digital. We think that information and ideas and technology are what will ensure that regional Australia continues to thrive, and of course that is absolutely spot on with the ideas that we're exploring here today and tomorrow. Aside from being a journalist who's part of a company with a very big idea, I'm also a farmer's daughter and sister and wife and mother. So I grew up at Quandialla near West Wyalong, and I live at Wallenbean, and some of you will be lucky enough to know that that's God's own country for cropping. I understand from Allister there might be a bit of an argument about that as a Finley boy, but you know, it depends on what you're cropping, I think. As my nearest and dearest have said to me while trundling down the paddock sowing wheat or watching the neighbours do so, I wonder what happens to all the data. Where's all the information going? We've got a terrific panel to answer some of your questions around what you've just heard from Rosemary on Secretary Metcalfe's response, but I'll introduce the panel from your left. Allister Clarke is with us. He's a PhD student at the Gulbali Institute of Agriculture, Water and Environment here at CSU. He's from a family farm at Finley, and with an Ag Science degree from Sydney University under his belt, he's pursuing a PhD via an industry project that's coordinated by Sunrise and the Food Agility Cooperative Research Centre, the CRC. But his work isn't so much about harvesting rice as mining data and trying to develop predictive models that will forecast the post-harvest quality of rice deliveries, explain the key factors that are driving variation, and what that adds up to is a better understanding and ultimately distribution and marketing of the rice harvest. He was a finalist in the New South Wales RAS Rural Achiever Award, which is aimed at recognising young future leaders who will make a significant contribution to their community. Next to him, Richard Norton, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the Food Agility CRC. He's had an extensive executive career across retail, innovation, logistics, marketing and agribusiness, including time as the Managing Director of Meat and Livestock Australia, Managing Director of Landmark Operations and General Manager of Retail at Elders. He's looked after large amounts of money at the top end of town with a whole lot of ASX-listed companies, and he's currently a non-executive director at Reefer Salutary Australia and Prime Safe Victoria, with a list of other boardroom positions across the sector. To my right, Gabriela Ceregra is Food Agility's Data Policy Manager. She's developing best practice data management policies for food agility projects and industry. Her expertise is data management. When we briefed for this discussion, she warned me that her field was narrow but very deep. Very, very deep. So I think she probably knows things that the rest of us in this room can barely dream of. Her insights into how data is created, managed and used across global organisations, and the risk management and regulatory requirements that need to be considered to create sustainable and scalable data ecosystems. And joining us on screen, Dan Winson is with us too, founder and CEO of Zetifi, which is an Australian wireless networking startup that's developed new technology to overcome the connectivity challenges faced by farmers and residents in rural and remote areas. Now, this is an initiative I applaud because Telstra are constantly telling me, don't say at conferences that you've got no mobile reception on the farm, but we haven't. So that'll be another phone call from them. Zetifi's products extend the coverage of the existing 4G, 5G and satellite networks to highways and byways and the places in between using long-range private or public Wi-Fi networks. Dan is also a hometown boy here in Wagga. That passion for rural connectivity materialised during his 10-year tenure as a network engineering lecturer here at Charles Sturt and also at TAFE New South Wales in Wagga, where he was regularly exposed to the issues caused by said poor connectivity in surrounding agricultural regions, and he is hardly alone there. Now, this is an open panel session, so as Sam said to you, much of the conversation depends on you. And look, let's be frank, it's a rare opportunity to get this level of seniority and innovation together on one stage. And given we've just had a change of government, it's a very interesting time to be asking these questions. So everyone here in the audience, online and in person, can ask questions via the Slido platform. These will be moderated and forwarded to me. I don't promise to get to every single one of them in their exact form, but I'll have them in front of me and we'll work through them. And as Sam said, the password is DAS22. So please hop into it, get them coming to me. Rosemary, I'm going to go to you first. I did have a whole list of really tricky questions for Secretary Metcalfe about the election and those outcomes, which were interesting to say the least. But I just wonder whether there are any indications thus far about a change in the government's priorities for the sector, the importance of regional Australia. I know we're all desperately curious about that.
Thanks very much, Genevieve, and as I mentioned, great to be part of the panel. Look, I think that it's fair to say that there is tremendous support right across the political spectrum for the agriculture, fisheries and forestry sector, and I think that that's really important because of the long-term nature of many of the investments that businesses make in those industries. And certainly, I think during the campaign, we have seen a number of commitments from the incoming government, particularly around forestry and innovation that we'll be looking to take forward. But there's a whole range of work that we will continue to take forward, including through the research and development corporations, to support the sector through our work on trade, through our work on workforce. So I think there will be, of course, new initiatives that ministers will want to take forward, but there will also, I think, be a strong continuation of many of the areas of focus. Because I think it's, as I said, right across the political spectrum, I think there is certainly a recognition around things like the importance of trade, the importance of biosecurity, the importance of access to skilled and unskilled labour, to name a few. So as was flagged, I think by Sam, Secretary Metcalfe is in the process of briefing incoming ministers following the swearing in, and that'll continue, and then we'll move to really focus on the implementation of those commitments.
Oh, I seem to have, no, I've gone. So, Rosemary, where will the department's priorities lie for this term?
Biosecurity is, there are some, new and emerging challenges in biosecurity, in making sure that we support our meat and livestock and our grain sectors to deal with those challenges. Things like COVID-19 and changes in shipping patterns, changes in climate are changing the threat that we face, and so we need to make sure that we are able to anticipate those threats and respond, for example, to the most recent outbreak of Japanese encephalitis. So I think biosecurity will remain a really big focus in our work at the borders, not only with cargo but with people. Of course, many threats to biosecurity coming through the mail and those sort of parcel pathways. So I think biosecurity is a really important underpinning of the success of the agriculture sector, not only in terms of the trade and the premium, but also in terms of the success, the day-to-day success of the sector. So biosecurity will remain really important. Trade will remain really important, because so much of what we produce is exported, 70% is exported, and to the extent that we get gains in productivity and in premium, we want to be able to export that to those growing markets in our near region and further afield. And then I think there will be continued pressure around, as I mentioned, things like labour force. We have been very successful over the course of the pandemic in working with industry to make sure that different sectors, particularly horticulture and our abattoirs, have access to labour from the Pacific. And also increasingly now from backpackers and working holiday makers as the borders reopen. So I think that there will be a continued underpinning of a range of areas of focus for government around trade and biosecurity and labour, combined with those that extra focus, particularly in some sectors like forestry, where the incoming government had a particular area of focus. Of course, there is also an ongoing focus in relation to climate and adaptation to a changing climate, to mitigation. We have the Future Drought Fund, which is $5 billion that is set aside to draw on every year in terms of assisting the sector to be ready for drought. And so that's a really important ongoing program that supports our agricultural sectors. As I mentioned earlier, the RDCs and others across our research and development ecosystem are really focused on climate and adaptation and making sure that our farmers are able to thrive in what is a volatile climatic situation at times.
Richard, I might go to you with a question about how the future looks to you. I think everyone in this room is celebrating the fact that it looks like 3 amazing good seasons in a row, but everyone who's come off a farm is also thinking, so when's the next drought coming along? The NFF has set a target of building Australian agriculture to a $100 billion industry by 2030. How possible does that look to you?
Well, in the current commodity pricing right across the whole sector, it's very achievable. Noting but Rosemary's risks of what's on our doorstep, particularly in the beef industry around lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease being in Indonesia, the ability to really have a dramatic and long-term impact on our export markets if it came to Australia. So I know you asked a question, but if I may, I'll ask one back to Rosemary of the details that are in place. I don't want to be an extremist, but are we considering, the tourism with Indonesia, knowing that quid pro quo, it does have the ability to wipe out our Australian beef industry?
That's a biosecurity question straight up, Rosemary. How do you respond?
Thank you. Look, I think what I would say is that we are taking the potential biosecurity implications of a range of things, whether it's lumpy skin or foot and mouth disease, very seriously, and examining all the different options for how we might address that. Mark Shipp, our Chief Veterinary Officer, and his Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer have been travelling extensively with our neighbours. We do a lot to support our neighbouring countries to assist them to manage biosecurity because, of course, while I know we're focusing on our own industry, of course, these are devastating diseases and pests for our neighbouring countries as well. And so that outreach and that connection into our neighbouring countries, I think, is tremendously important. To assist those sectors to be able to manage and then also understand the risks. So I think that I would probably leave it to Andrew Tongue and others who are kind of responsible for biosecurity to sort of go into detail around the particular measures. But I think it's fair to say that we look at a range of different things that we can do to try and reduce our risks and to work with industry to do that.
And Richard, I will turn back to you because you dodged that one very deftly by asking a question yourself. But I do want to dwell for a moment because this will lead us into data and what we can do to improve our efficiencies. Yes, we're in a terrific run of seasons. Prices are extraordinarily good. But as we look around the world, we also notice that our competitors are making significant efficiency gains. We're in perhaps some danger of losing the edges that we have because of the efficiency of our production. We've relied on that for a very long time in the Australian agricultural industry. What is our unique selling point as we go into the future? How would we realise those expectations of the $100 billion business?
Okay, I will answer the question now. My apologies.
Marvellous.
I just had to get that one off. I've got a bit of interest in the beef industry. A lot of debt there. But to quote KPMG, I think 25% uplift in productivity if we start realising the potential of data across the agricultural sector. And we are then involved in writing policy. We've written data sharing agreements. Gabby's looking after data sharing agreements for departments of agriculture around how we share data. It is the next frontier. And to give an example, you're an ASX listed company and you've got legislation written in about your data as IP and it can't be breached, or you can go to jail or you can be fined. So how do you sit there and go, well, I want to share my data, I want to benchmark it? Even Lawson's Grains this morning saying their data from their properties is their IP. So I didn't get the intent that they were really willing to share it. To share the data across the whole industry is only going to increase productivity. And I suppose the project that we're doing now with UTS and Bosch is sort of technology that has been in other industries. It's been in ASIO, it's used in the credit card industry, and they're data protected privacy databases that are encrypted in clean rooms. You can put the data in, you can use the data, you put the data in as a listed company, as an example, knowing it's not going to get breached, knowing that the data is only going to be used for, say, benchmarking the herd or your genetics against the rest of industry, but you retain your IP. But the data is used for general industry good to increase the productivity.
Allister, to what extent can our digital efficiency and our level of innovation provide that unique selling point? How much efficiency gain do you think is possible if we look at this across the sector?
Yeah, well, I guess like with the rice industry, it's a unique industry in the fact that it's vertically integrated. So that sharing of data is something that, while for other industries, I guess it's maybe something they want to be able to get to, where they have both the post-harvest handling data and potentially some of the grower information about how the crop's been grown, and then through to the marketing. Well, it's something that the rice industry has because of the nature of it. And so we've been able to, I guess, previously it's been recorded for internal benefits within Sunrise, looking at management of their operations and management of sales to markets. And where our research project with Food Agility and CSU has been looking at is really figuring out, well, like what's an opportunity to be having benefits back to the growers? And we've had a direct reason for it, and that's what you mentioned before in predicting that quality. But even in that sense, there's a direct benefit to the industry in managing it there, and there's a small sort of insight and feedback loop back to the grower about, well, this was the quality you produced. You're now knowing it well ahead of time what you'd previously have been able to, and it gives the potential to actually have the full prices of the rice deliveries they're making paid earlier as well. So there's benefits in that. But I guess what we've been looking at then is actually, well, how do we provide the information back to them that benefits the crop production of the next crop they've grown, or explains why there was variation from one paddock to the next, or one bay to the next, or even between deliveries. So we've really been looking at actually making sure that we can explain things better and take it back from just having data sets that are shared, converting that into information and then converting that into recommendations, because unless it's getting all the way to a recommendation, there's not necessarily the benefit back to the grower. And I think that's where the data sharing piece has probably always been a bit of a carrot and a stick thing. It's either you've got to provide the information or we won't buy that piece of product, or maybe they try and provide a carrot. And previously, in other industries as well, but as an example from the rice industry, if you share that data, you went into a draw to win a Pioneer or a Gator, like four-wheeler, machine, and that was the benefit of it. But now we're sort of getting to the point where we're actually able to use that information and have direct farm management benefits if it's done correctly. Like talking to a few people earlier today, I think all the different data pieces that are out there, in some sense, like, if the grower wants to know something, it's like I feel like a sweet treat, so I want a cake. But if I gave you eggs, milk, butter and flour, that's not what you wanted. So we're trying to get to the point where we can actually then, turn that data into information, and maybe that's the recipe. But we then need to be able to get the information into those recommendations, and that's sort of the oven that allows us to actually turn it into that. And so that's where a lot of research is available, and I think the Global Digital Farm is going to be able to create a lot of case studies around how we can connect those data sets and how we do actually turn it into decision making on farm based off of that information.
And Gabby, I might come to you on this, because this is a really interesting bit of territory we're going into. If I put my farmer's hat on, I want to share all sorts of data. I want to be able to benchmark. I want to be able to understand what's going on across my part of the industry. That's really fascinating. If I put my digital media participants hat on, we've got a bit of tech expertise that we'd rather share with absolutely nobody. So let's talk about about this idea of sharing and access. I've got a question from Joe who says, everyone wants farm data. How can we ensure that farmers are not going to get ripped off? Will they be buying their data back in the form of an algorithm?
Good question, thanks. And I guess, the thing with the data, it's almost like a secret. If I share a secret with you, I expect you to keep it unless we have a discussion and then I give you permission to perhaps pass it on to Richard or my right. And so there's a kind of a trust involved there in that relationship. And with what we want is responsible and safe sharing of data. So we definitely don't want data to stop flowing. We want it flowing around. We want it to go all the way up down the supply chain, but very much with the farmer's permission. And so that's how we've been working on kind of the governance frameworks around that to set some guidance around what is the kind of the responsible way to be sharing data. And in the case of the farmers who, some of them are quite worried about what will happen with their data, is how do we provide that mechanism and that assurance for them that, who they're engaging with to build that algorithm is going to do the right thing by them. Yeah,
and another question on this from Katie, who says, in a world in which companies can already tell you what's happening in your back paddock, and I referenced my introduction, people trundling along with GPS and the tractor and thinking, where is this data going? Is who owns the data a relevant question, or is it a redundant question already? What's going on that we don't know about?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a lot of new thinking around that, and legally you can't own the data, but you can control it. And so a lot of the language we're using around that now is who's controlling the data and who has the rights to do that, who has the right to access it, to manage it. So there's often a few different parties involved in the chain of data management. Like the farmer is usually the data originator, and then that might get passed down the track. So in the case of GPS, and I know that's quite a controversial thing, having satellite images taken of your farm and that being out in the public domain, farmers in a way have lost control of that data, and that's where the feelings are coming from around it.
Dan, I just want to bring you in here. I mean, it certainly occurs to me that this is a really sort of highly evolved conversation that we're having here. How much of it is dependent on connectivity?
2/3 of it, I guess, would be the simple answer. That's the number of Australian farms that have poor or inadequate coverage out in their fields. So from a very practical point of view, when you ask where is this data going, in 2/3 of cases, the best case scenario right now is that it's going onto a flash drive that gets lost in the bottom of a desk drawer somewhere. But there is a lot of hope that we can solve that. And it's not just Zetifi, it's the entire supply chain that's taking steps to solve this. Your Case IH and your John Deere, your Massey Fergusons, your Trimbles of the world, building connectivity into the locations where this data is collected. And that is a key step to being able to get it off the farm. Zetifi, what we sort of focus on is providing that extra little bit of connectivity where Telstra can't.
Yeah, and Rosemary, if I could bring you in here, a question from Tom who says, biosecurity, traceability in livestock is controlled by legislation pointing to a standard of outdated 2G era technology, which wouldn't appear to show quite the degree of attention from government we might expect in this area. I can see you taking notes, but...
Thank you. Look, I think what we've seen... right across digital, right across all sectors, is that it moves very quickly, and there may well be from time to time, constraints in legislation that haven't kept up, or that need to be revisited. I'm not familiar with that particular requirement, but certainly we recognise that there are the kinds of challenges, including that Dan and Gabriela and others have identified around data ownership, around access to connectivity, around building the skills of producers and knowledge around the technology available. And it's really kind of a suite of things, if you like, that need to I think come together to really enable the kind of data uptake and the I guess the benefit realisation from all of that, rather than there only sort of being one thing that if we all worked on it would work. It's quite an interconnected ecosystem.
I've got a couple of questions that perhaps are paired together and can go to the whole panel. Lewis says, why is everyone so worried about who owns the data? No one's talking about who benefit or owns the value created post-processing, and he thinks that's where we need to focus. But then perhaps I could sort of couch this in broader terms for all of you. What is the ideal government response for agricultural technology, research and development and extension? I mean, what does that look like to the panel? And depending on what we get out of this, Rosemary will be taking even more furious notes for the new Agriculture Minister. But Allister, to you first, what do you think the ideal government response should be?
I mean, maybe from my perspective of like having gone through my undergrad most recently, and even like not that long ago being in the position of some of the high schoolers that were here earlier, like there's definitely a big skills transition that's happening in what's needed to be a farmer or to be a farm advisor as well. And so I think that means that there's obviously a skills gap, but it also means that more time can be allocated to other skills, like dad back at home and his dad before him on the farm, like being able to be a really sound sort of farm mechanic was something that was really, really important. But if we're going to more extremely high-tech autonomous technology and these sorts of things, well then, yeah, I don't think like just being able to tinker with the bits and pieces of a machine is going to get you very far. You're going to need to have like expert technicians that are coming from different backgrounds and whatnot. So there's a big area for development there, and I think that kind of goes to questions that were addressed earlier about potentially losing jobs in farming systems, but having new jobs brought in where you need to have those high-level technicians there. So I think there's big skill development areas for both people going through high school, whether if they're doing agriculture, and then going to more sort of post-high school study, whether that's through a tertiary institute or through something more like a TAFE potentially. In using technology, being able to understand the analysis of it, and then also understand the insights of it that you're working through with your agros. And I think also potentially in agros being able to better understand how farmers can use those technologies and have potentials to actually provide support to them in different software and hardware that's used. And I think a potential another gap that it's going to open up is that, you know, it might be more time where farmers can actually upskill in their HR management. I think, like, you know, my sister was previously on a large sort of family beef farm up in Northern Territory, and it was a good business and she enjoyed working for it, but ended up having an opportunity to join a larger corporate. And when she was there, it was obviously an increase in pay, which I think a lot of farmers around the area will know that it's hard to compete with the corporate businesses on pay alone. But they also had really good HR policies in place where quarterly she'd have a meeting with a supervisor or a manager, and they talk about where does she want to get to in her own personal development on that property. And like, you know, I think my dad's a good farmer and I think he's a good person, but doesn't necessarily know that he knows how to set up those conversations. And potentially it's not even a thing for dad to do. Maybe it's someone else on the farm that's allowing that to happen. So I think, yeah, some of the skills and advancements and sort of allocation of skills that can happen is something that the government could have something in place where they're trying to get more of those skill developments addressed in the training that younger people are doing as they're coming into the industry. And then, like Rosemary talked about before, some of those shorter course options or micro accreditations that, you know, farmers that are out there can still upskill in, you know, in shorter periods of time that makes sense and time-wise for them. And
I do want to ask you in a minute about the digital divide, so just hold that thought. But Richard, to you, what's your thought about the ideal government response for ag technology, research and development and extension? What does that look like to you?
But the extension part, and whilst Dan was talking, I thought what is now a traditional agronomist might become a technologist in the future, where they're not just doing plant-based science, but dealing with data management off farm and helping producers manage data and technology. In terms of government around this area of data, I would like government to stay out and let industry manage itself through what's happening with national farmers as the lead for where we're going as an industry around data policies, data agreements. Because I think you don't want to have to get into legislation. Legislation, I think, is the last avenue for what we want for the industry. But as long as we have, and Food Agility's done data sharing agreements reviewed by Tier 1 lawyers, and you can imagine what that's like, trying to tell Tier 1 lawyers about data agreements within agriculture. So a long, extended process. But to their credit, we got it down to 30 pages. And hope to get it down to 4, so it's easy to use web-based agreements that farmers can use because of the power of data. So at this stage, Rosemary, please keep foot and mouth disease out and we'll manage the data.
Okay, Dan, what are your thoughts on this? What sort of standard do you think government needs to be setting in this area?
I'd like the government to continue supporting R&D and innovation, but in particular the late stage innovation and commercialisation activities where there's a gap. Australia's got an excellent reputation for early stage R&D, and we've made some really impressive improvements in commercialising that technology, but I think that there's more work to do and any opportunities to showcase that innovation and get it into market so that it can be adopted by people on the ground. Anything the government can do there, typically around funding for things like the 5G Innovation Initiative, for example, are making a big impact in startups' abilities to actually build and launch products.
And Gabby, what about you?
Yes, so I'll just add to what Richard was saying, is that the creation of a code of practice, that being the farm data code, which is, has been published and is being updated, is something we want to roll out. And we know that that's a standard that's higher than what the industry is probably doing at the moment. And so the government support that will be really helpful there is to help ag techs lift up their practices, when sometimes that means funding for more technology development, because there needs to be some certain processes they need to put in place. Or changes to their products that they need to make to meet the code of practice. So I think that's probably the most practical way to try to close the gap between where we are and where we want to be.
I do have a question that perhaps relates to this from Bruno, who says, can the blockchain securing data in a digital ledger protect the owner with his private key and public key access? Don't tell me there's going to be silence on the pass. Okay, we'll park that one for the moment, and perhaps that leads on to where I wanted to go, and go back to you, Allister, with this idea of the digital divide that might open up generationally. We're talking as if everybody in the room understands exactly what we're all talking about here on the panel. And if I think about in my own farming household, the difference between one of my sons who's an agronomist doing precision ag down in Ballarat, working on really cutting edge stuff, constantly using data, and his father who can barely navigate Facebook. Obviously there is going to be a digital divide. Some people are going to be more digitally literate than others. What sort of an issue is that for the kinds of conversations we're having about data management, the use that we can put data to on farms?
Yeah, I think there's still, we talked about value proposition earlier and different bits and pieces, and understanding what the value is to the growers of using digital ag technologies better. And I think when that's better realised, there is going to be a gap where producers are missing out on some of that value and the benefits that actually brings. So I think there's opportunities where, like, during my ag science degree, I was fortunate enough to do a couple of tours through Southeast Asia and different parts where Australia is spending research money in helping those nations better produce their agricultural products. And over there, they would have, say, a model farm, and they use the lead farmer model, where you have a particular area where someone is applying something like direct drilling of rice, or better chemical management of weeds, these sort of technologies, and well, not so much technology, procedures that we have down pat in Australia. And that was the model that they used to try and upskill growers, by not just having a research institute say, this is how you do it and why, actually being able to see, to an extent, what's it doing on my neighbour's property, how are they doing it, and having someone doing it in best practice. And I think that's an area where potentially with like digital solutions coming in and the benefits that can come from it can be showcased using that sort of a procedure, I guess. Like, you've got the global digital farm, there's lots of research that will be coming from it, but there's also an opportunity to be running field days, or for growers to come and visit things and say, okay, well, I'm in the Wagga region, I've heard about this technology solution, how does it actually work? I want to see it on a property that's somewhat similar to mine, or uses it in a particular way. And I think that's going to be one where there'll be opportunities, because like for someone like your husband or someone like my dad, if he doesn't see a benefit in using it, well, then he's not going to spend the time on doing it. Like, it's not something that he'll necessarily be thinking out. So if they can show the benefit first, provide that carrot, let them have the understanding of where the benefits is. And there's still rooms where that benefit needs to be found. But I think those sorts of opportunities Australia's gone out and pushed out elsewhere to upskill growers around the world, well, maybe that's something that needs to be looked at home for new technologies that are coming in and new procedures that we haven't previously done. And I think potentially what Richard was talking about before, there's an opportunity for agronomic consultants to potentially have something to do with that, or it might be an MLA extension officer saying, I'm skilled in using a technology like AgriReb or like Maya grazing. you can call up their customer support in Sydney, but if you want hands-on assistance with it, you've got an MLA advisor or a nutrient ag stock and station agent advisor that can actually help with some of those technologies as well.
Yeah.
But just on that point, that divide, I'd like to give agriculture a bit more credit than perhaps some people do in terms of its adoption of technology and increases in productivity from that technology, particularly in the grain sector. And the livestock sector was marketing livestock on Auctions Plus in 1988. There's not too many other industries in the whole world that were marketing livestock on a green screen in 1988, and it's evolved to where it is today. I think agriculture is an early adopter. I think what we're talking about, connectivity, has been one of the huge barriers to more adoption. But don't underplay the sector. And I'm going out to register technology agronomists, and that will evolve as a whole industry, and farmers will get the right people on farm to help them, as they have always done, to build their productivity gains.
Rosemary, I didn't ask you about ideal government responses to this for the obvious reason that you're the person that needs to make sure that actually happens. But I am interested in the government's response to ensuring that older generational farmers aren't left behind as the industry adapts to these new technologies and practices. What indicators are there from the department that you focused in that direction?
Yeah, look, I think just picking up on the points of a number of the panellists. I mean, it is kind of an integrated system. Sometimes it is about skilling up an individual, business owner of an individual producer. Other times it's about facilitating the expertise and assistance from others. Whether it's agronomists or it's IT technicians or whoever. I think that the point about regulation was well made. Regulations have got to be fit for purpose, and if there's not a need for it, then it's best for government not to be intervening and potentially putting in barriers or impediments that were unintended or that might become barriers and impediments in the future. I think it was Dan made a really good point about commercialisation. We and that's one of the reasons why I mentioned GrowAg. I think that there is a recognition that we have lots of good ideas. It's about how we commercialise, and it's about how we access other markets, because Australia, I guess, in a relative sense, is not as big a market as many other countries. So it's important that we're able to establish those partnerships with other countries, with other industries who might be able to use those technologies. So I think really a kind of the panel discussion kind of reinforced the earlier discussion around the importance of connection between different parts of industry, and there being a kind of a multifaceted range of issues, rather than there being one thing that government could do or one thing that an individual producer could do. I think there's a range of things that we can all do to help that uplift.
And Rosemary, while I'm on that, there is a question from Julie, perhaps on the other end of the spectrum, that says, have you got suggestions for encouraging more people, especially young people, into existing vocational training to build the digital skills of the agricultural workforce?
Yeah, so look, there's been quite a number of changes to the fee structures for different courses to try and encourage people to move into, to make them basically less expensive, right, in a relative sense. So to encourage people to move into ag, whether it's around university level qualifications or TAFE or others. So there are some of those sort of pricing signals that I think are important. But I think also, to the extent that the sector is uplifting generally, people seeing what other producers are doing, people understanding the benefit of the expertise being brought in, and that I think will also encourage an uplift, because people will learn from each other and the benefits that come from having that additional skill. In the same way that being a good mechanic in the past was really important, people realise that that there's potential for that other realisation around other skills and experiences.
Dan, it certainly occurs to me that one of the issues here is that, yes, there is perhaps an age divide, and there's perhaps a sort of a digital native kind of divide going on in the agricultural sector. But as we've said a number of times, there is also just a simple connectivity divide. And a point made to me very forcibly when chairing a couple of RDA panels recently is that we really face a risk in Australia that we're going to have a chasm down the middle between people who are digitally connected and people who aren't, and that's going to be on the basis of that capacity alone. And I've got a question from Michael for you, saying, is Starlink, for instance, going to supersede the NBN? Has it got unlimited capacity, or will it be saturated soon? What are the answers to that sort of real chasm for those of us who just can't necessarily key into any of this?
Well, to answer your first part of your question or your comment around the digital divide and the age skills gap, speaking from my previous life as someone who taught people of all ages, I'd actually have to disagree on that one. I'd go with Richard that farmers are perfectly capable of adopting digital technologies when it delivers real value. Like the iPhone was only released in 2007, and 5 years later, every farmer had one. They may not use all of the apps that I use, but where it benefits their business, they are perfectly capable of adapting technologies. On the connectivity piece, certainly there's some real challenges there, and Starlink is a huge part of the problem. So Starlink provides amazing connectivity to a household or to a shed. They've just released a product that can be taken around with you and used in a fixed location with a recreational vehicle, which is really exciting. From a capacity point of view, it's looking very promising that they will be able to solve those challenges moving forward by having space lasers. Who would have thought that we'd be talking about space lasers only a few years ago? But yeah, there will be still a coverage gap. So Starlink brings it to a location, and we still are working on getting that out into the paddocks so that people can use the technology that they want to use.
Richard, I just wonder, we've got about sort of 10, 15 minutes left in this conversation. I want to take this to marketing and what happens beyond the farm gate. And I think often on farms we've had in the past a tendency to sort of sit there and go, oh, well, look, I've grown it, and you work out what happens next. What's the potential for data to translate into how we tell the story of what happens on our farms, how we market our produce? There's huge growing interest in sustainability, in origin stories. What sort of fields are opening up for us if we get the data collection right?
And it goes to everything that you said. It's ability to tell that story, but not only tell the story, to be able to stand behind the product that we're selling. So it goes from what's going to evolve through blockchain and what value blockchain is going to add to industry. It's had some ups and downs so far, because I think a lot of people are coming with blockchain saying you need blockchain, as opposed to the value blockchain will add to your industry. And then I think we're working on a traceability for the berries industry to go right back to farm, where the berry was picked, all the way through to export markets using QR codes, old technology. So I think the data and digital piece and technology piece around how we qualify the product, quality assurance behind the product, but telling the story, and then, as discussed today, the benefits around sustainability of that product. I think it's all coming our way. We've seen it now through various products going to the end markets, and that's why Australia is particularly well placed. Better than most countries around the world because of our environmental credentials and biodiversity in our production systems as well. It is a huge opportunity to keep our product, Australian product, at the forefront of premium pricing across the world.
And Gabby, just talk us through those blockchain issues, because this is absolutely one of the things that will either give us enormous opportunities or completely block opportunities if we don't get it right. Talk to us about how that works.
It's interesting though, because blockchain is a way of tracing information, and the technical ins and outs of that can be complicated, and I'm not an expert, but definitely the passing of information down the chain. And I'll give you one example. I've been talking to a cattle farmer, and it's not particularly using blockchain, but he's been selling his cattle at 20% premium because he's providing the data about the cattle, like its fertility, its diet, its weight throughout the history of its life. And so getting paid a premium price. And I'm new to agriculture, so I likened it to selling your car with a perfectly filled in vehicle logbook, and so that there's a premium for that, and I think that's kind of where the value is.
Yeah, Allister, interested in your thoughts on that, because I know that goes straight to the work that you're doing in your PhD, the idea that you can trace via blockchain multiple points through a product's life, and that then evolves into a story that we tell about how we are growing and producing this food or fibre or whatever it is.
Yeah, I guess it's going to be a little bit dependent on the market that's buying it and the location or the sort of place that you're buying it, I suppose. Like if you're going to Woolies and you're buying lettuce maybe, if you're in a rush, you probably don't want to know the story. Maybe you want to see some metrics on the back of it, so a traffic light system that says, ticks this box, ticks that box, good enough for me, it's the same price or slightly more expensive, but I'm happy to cop it, that'll do. But if I want to know more about it, well then, maybe there's a QR code or there's the website that takes me through to hearing more of the story, and it's in a format that's actually applicable to learning a bit more of it, as opposed to maybe trying to fit too much information on a box that's, people aren't really interested in. And so like we spoke before about, if you're at a farmer's market, well, it's a completely different situation. People are going to a farmer's market because they're not necessarily in a rush to buy their groceries for the week on a Sunday afternoon when it's packed and it's the last thing you want to be doing. So, they maybe have more time, and you've got that opportunity to tell that story, maybe more personally, but also to have the data to back it up. But yeah, I think it's definitely going to, the data is going to allow it to be marketed in certain ways, but then there's going to be certain ways that it actually that story gets told depending on the situation, I suppose.
Yeah, and our ability to do that well could again be one of the unique selling points that we've got in a global market, couldn't it? If we're able to harvest our data well, if we're able to tell our story well using the data from the very beginning of the production cycle, then that becomes a really attractive part of the narrative, Gabby.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I do have a question on that. Who moderates the quality of data that's being shared or uploaded? Could bad data potentially lead to bad advice?
Yes, it can.
Yes, it can.
Rubbish in, rubbish out, I think is what they say in analytics. Allister will know with your modelling, right? If you're getting a lot of average data or incomplete data, inaccurate data, pretty much that's going to affect the results you're going to get and the information and the decision-making mechanism as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a couple more questions I want to throw to people. Dan, one for you from Sarah. Is there any movement to impose a minimum expectation or KPI requirement for companies for phone or service coverage maps, because the algorithms are really not effective?
There have been pushes from individual politicians for reform in that space, and I'm aware of 2 projects that are under scoping right now. One with the New South Wales Telco Authority, considering the state of connectivity throughout New South Wales, and of course the Australian Labor Party mentioned in their pre-election promises around a commitment to funding a coverage map using Australia Post vehicles to survey the nation and actually get real data around coverage, and more importantly than just coverage, the capability of the network in different locations, which is just as important as being able to get some signal. You need to actually be able to use it.
Rosemary, can I put that question to you?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not as deep involved in that side of things, but I think certainly there's a recognition of the importance of connectivity and the focus on improving that, not only for farming businesses but also for other businesses in rural and regional areas. We haven't sort of touched on this, but obviously we've seen the potential for people to work away from their traditional sort of places of work, and so I think that there's a whole range of impetus, if you like, or there are different drivers for improved connectivity. Part of it is businesses that have traditionally been in rural and regional areas, but I expect that with there being more modern ways of working, more flexible ways of working, that will also seek to provide impetus for providers to improve their coverage, because there will be more demand from different kinds of businesses in rural and regional areas for better connectivity.
Richard, one for you, and I think you're on board with this, whether it's true that the gap between farmers and technology is getting bigger. You think no, we've established that quite clearly, but the question is, what steps is Food Agility taking to minimise this gap? What are you doing about that yourself?
It's not necessarily in our brief as a CRC, because we have quite a narrow brief around, we operate in the digital and data space, but happy to comment on it, and it's a complex business today, agriculture. If you look at some of the plant and equipment used for cropping in this country, it's quite daunting, let alone expensive, and the centimetre precision of which you can plant a crop with today. Yes, if you're a new entrant, it would be quite daunting. But I do believe that the private sector and entrepreneurship in this country will step up and fill that gap, because they'll make money out of it. Agriculture is a highly profitable business. yes, 10, 15 years ago, maybe it wasn't, but it is now, and there's not too much on the horizon outside of a global World War III or anything like that says it won't be profitable at the levels that it is today. So I think you'll find that because of that profitability, you'll see, once we get the fundamentals right, an enormous uptake and desire for uptake of technology, and you'll find people that'll build businesses around providing that on farm.
So that perhaps leads to my last question, which comes from Ben. Allister, I'll go to you with this one to start with. How do panel members think the value proposition of tech applications for agriculture can be made clearer for farmers to understand the cost benefits?
Yeah, I think it's probably going to require collaboration with the farmers to understand that better, what the technology is being used for and what the opportunities are. I think there's technology coming in that has, it's solutions coming in that already have a problem, and there's solutions that are coming in that are looking for a problem. But some of those solutions that are coming in looking for a problem, they actually still may have that problem, but there's more work that needs to be done to actually figure out where that is. So I think it's definitely one where doing some of that work collaboratively and not just being a research institute that says, oh, this is the benefit, and then talking to the farmers about it. I think over the last couple of days, talking to people about PhD research that we're doing and different bits and pieces with research projects that have happened and tech that's been developed. Yeah, so much of the time it's developed first and then the conversation is had, as opposed to having that collaborative conversations first. So I think it's definitely a thing that can lead to benefits on that sense.
Gabby, what are your thoughts on that? Where could perhaps investment, public and private, be targeted to lift agriculture's digital capability to make it obvious to farmers where the cost benefits are in them engaging? Yeah,
there's definitely some work to be done on the awareness of the value of data out in the community. I think the farmers that are on top of it, they understand the benefits they can get, like the cattle farmer I was talking to. He was actually surprised he could get a premium, but now he's telling all his friends, so that's really good. But yeah, there's still quite a lot of a way to go. Awareness building and real life application, participation in research programs, the kind of projects that are happening here that we've seen demoed. And I think there's also a little bit of work to be done by the kind of the tech companies themselves that, making products that are really easy to use and intuitive, and closing that digital maturity that we were talking about before. It's not all about trying to get the farmers to be more digitally mature. It's actually making products that are easy to use as well.
Do you reckon they could invent an iPad where the cover doesn't crack when you drop it in the sheep race?
I think the military have got something like that already, so maybe.
My brother, who is very switched on to all of this, had an iPad, he said, a day and a half before someone dropped it in the race while we were doing the RAM values. Look, it's been a really terrific and intriguing conversation, and I'd like you to please thank Allister, Richard, Gabby, Rosemary and Dan, and thank you very much for your questions.